Alrighty. So this video is on making a simple mallet. Of course, now I have no space because I got all the stuff together. So, first thing, a mallet is spindle work. So, kind of basic overview, real quick. So there are two basic orientations of wood on the lathe. This is a 4x4. It's just pine. As you can see, these are the annual rings, and so the tree was growing what was this way, right? That makes this a spindle blank because the growth rings are oriented, or the tree growth is oriented this way. This guy is a bowl blank. It's a piece of koa that I picked up a couple of weeks ago. When I turn it, it will be oriented this way. Now you can see there's the heartwood, sapwood, right? The tree, obviously the outside of the tree, was growing this way. So, spindle blank, trees growing along the axis of the lathe. Bowl blank, it's going, or also called a face work, is the tree is growing at a right angle to the lathe. You can certainly get pieces that don't have distinguishable growth rings. The most obvious case would be a burl, which is a growth on the side of a tree. The grain is going every which way. But 90% of the time, you're either dealing with a bowl blank where the grain is this way, or a spindle blank where the grain is this way. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Which tools you use can be different based on which of those you're turning. So, for instance, this is a spindle roughing gouge, originally just called a roughing gouge, typically abbreviated an SRG. It is only used for spindle blanks. It is not used for bowl blanks. Even though it looks really big, it actually has a very small tang that attaches it to the handle. So while it's got all this meat up front, this little guy will bend if you abuse this tool. The way to abuse this tool is to be cutting end grain. Okay, so with a bowl blank as it's spinning, so quick thing about end grain. So this is end grain. You can see if you're looking straight at the annual rings, if you're looking in line with the pith, you're looking at end grain. If you're looking at either of these guys, you're looking at side grain or face grain. It varies. I think they're very subtly different. But for the most part, it's either side or end. If it's end grain, this is not the tool to be using. If you want to cut end grain, grab yourself a bowl gouge or a spindle gouge or a skew if you're feeling really brave. Do not use an SRG on end grain. I actually just saw a video this morning of a wood turning expert using an SRG for roughing down a bowl blank. Now he was taking really light cuts, and so that's okay. But normally when you're roughing down a bowl blank, you're not taking light cuts. You're taking pretty heavy cuts. And if you take heavy cuts with one of these and you get into end grain, it is quite possible that this will bend. It can snap, and when it snaps, it'll fly. So getting hit by this is probably much worse than getting hit by a flying blank. And getting hit by a flying blank is no fun. So, about blanks. Originally, I was going to use this guy. This has got the pith in it. That's why it's got a crack in it. Well, also it's probably fairly green when it was cut, because a lot of the stuff that you buy at the hardware store was cut green and then, I don't know, dried on the truck on the way there or something. Or they did some sort of a kiln drying that was really fast. It didn't get all the water out. Certainly as boards get thicker, it gets harder to get all the water out. So this guy obviously still had a lot of tension, and it cracked, right? I was thinking of using this, but I decided for the sake of safety to avoid it. Again, as you're cutting, if you hit this, and you will, depending on how heavy of a cut you're taking, you could tear the whole piece apart, or have a big chunk of it fly out. It's just going to add complications, and I thought it'd be good as an example of what not to use for wood turning. So quite often when you're dealing with blanks, you're looking for end checking, any cracks. This piece actually looks really good. So this is just a piece of 4x4, what is it, pine fir, one of those, one of the soft woods that they sell at the hardware store that you buy for whatever. One thing about hardware store purchased lumber is a friend of mine, one of the first people I knew who owned a lathe, actually his first project was a mallet, and he used a 4x4 that was treated, which means that it was impregnated with arsenic and other stuff to keep bugs and rot and mold from eating it, because it's designed to be stuck in as a fence post in the bare dirt. He's still alive, as far as I know, but I'm pretty sure he never used treated lumber again. He just wasn't thinking. But don't use treated lumber for wood turning, just because arsenic bad, dyeing generally bad. So yeah, don't do it. So because I have a decent collection of chucks, I could actually take this guy and fit it into this 150 millimeter 5-inch chuck. Most folks probably don't have one of these, so instead I'm going to show you a more conventional way to do it, which is called turning between centers. So the standard 4-spur drive looks like this. It has 4 little teeth that bite into the wood and a little point that keeps the wood centered. These are kind of cool. I tend not to use them as much now. The one that I like is, I believe it's referred to as a safety drive, because when things bind up, these outside teeth can actually spin. I like these partially because there's more contact between the drive and the piece. It's easier to center the piece. Now, so that goes in there. This I just cut on my compound miter saw, so I know these faces are, these corners are right angles. So I'm not worried about this being off center. But there are cases where having something like a safety drive to give you a better indication of center, or if you're starting out and you're worried that you might have a catch and bind up the piece, it's good to have a drive that's going to be a little bit more forgiving. I just like them better than the 4-point ones. I found they tend to dig little channels into the piece as you work it, especially for softer woods. So I would, it's a personal choice. I like it. I also like this little one. Same manufacturer. I think I got these off Amazon. I think they're PSIs. This little guy is the same diameter, within about a 64th of an inch, of my live center, and so I can use this when turning rolling pins as a way of gauging, basically getting even thickness on either end without having to use calipers. So, pencil helps, and a ruler. So this guy, I use it for a couple of different things. Obviously for drawing straight lines, and then he's also got a center finder, which is great for doing for figuring out roughly the center on a bulb length. It'll work for this as well, but really all you need to do is just connect the diagonals. So you just go corner to corner. Now, another thing that I've seen folks do that I've stopped doing is they will use a mallet and they will drive their spur drive into the end of the wood. I don't know why they do that. I guess the idea is it would seat better. The tricky part about that is once you have one of these sticking out of the end of this log, somehow finagling it onto the. Sometimes it falls out, right? Which I don't know. Does that defeat the purpose of driving it in? So what I found is that a hole punch. Where'd it go? Oh no, I lost my hole punch. So normally I have a hole punch right there, and it has gone walkabout. Apparently, it's not really necessary. It just makes life a little bit easier. Well, I'll find that when I clean. You can do without it, but with a hole punch, you could put a mark right there at the X, and it just gives you a little dimple to put the point into. You don't really need it. You can just eyeball it. Normally what I do is I figure out roughly where I'm going to be and then lock the tailstock, and then sometimes it's easier to kind of hold the two like that. You can also sometimes use the tool rest as an anchor for your hand if you're old and shaky. You can be coming. So then what I do is I just, sorry, I gotta figure out how to work around the camera. Really jam that down because I don't want it to move. And then torque this guy down until it starts to push the tool, the tailstock back. Okay, that's pretty darn tight. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rough this down with an SRG. This is side grain, so this is the right tool for the job. And then once we get it to be round, I'm going to adjust the tool rest height so that it's roughly centered. Actually, this is a little high. I like to actually try to cut on center, but I think with the SRG you want to be slightly above center. So there's, right, center coming out from, let me adjust this, coming out from the center line and the axis out. So I normally want the cutting edge to be at that level. That seems to be a generally good rule for pretty much any kind of cutting tool. And then you can eyeball parallel by looking at the ways beneath, and then yeah, it looks like pretty good clearance. With variable speed lathes, always make sure you turn it down unless you know what speed it's at because you were just using it. And then I don't know. I'm going to bring it up to about, that's 500. Probably, we can go that fast, that's fine. And then, so the way that I hold the SRG, and there's another thing that differs from others, is I normally have my right hand up near the ferrule, that's this metal ring, and then my left hand is basically guiding it on the tool rest, and then I normally bring it up against my side because it's much easier to control the tool movement with your body than it is to control it with your hands. And that's also generally true. That's not just this tool, that's almost any tool. That was interesting. So it caught and then it actually shifted. Must have been the tool rest that moved. Huh. Probably this knot is what threw it off. Anyway, so right now what I'm doing is I'm knocking off the high points. That's going to be a problem. My little safety guy has now drilled a little ring. Well, let's see if it still works. Oh, I didn't tighten down this guy. That might also have been a problem. Alright, let's see if this keeps working. A lot of woodworking and wood turning is adapting to interesting challenges. So normally, in fact almost always, you want to come from the higher wood down to your, closer to your circular piece. As you may have noticed, when I came back, all of a sudden the wood grabbed it and pulled the tool more quickly than I had originally wanted. So you typically want to start from the highest point, and then you're slowly working it down. As you can see, this is you might be able to see, this is a fairly rough cut. This is not intended as the finished surface, though you can get a pretty decent surface with an SRG. So I feel this is a little dull on this side. Let me splice in a little video on how to sharpen this sucker. Okay, so this is a Roberts Orby Pro Edge sharpening belt. I like it a lot. I think right now it's already set to 40 degrees. I actually had to drill it for 40 because there isn't a hole for 40. You could probably get by with 45 or 35, but I really like Stuart Batty's system, and he uses 40 degrees for almost everything, and so do I. So to sharpen the SRG, it's one of the easiest. The only thing probably easier is like a parting tool. And so platforms at 40 degrees. So you can see this is a single bevel, so there's no sharpening on the inside. You only have to sharpen this one side. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it there at a right angle to the belt, and then just roll it this way, like that, and then there. You don't go past the flat, right? You don't want to roll this over. You just want to get to what Stu calls thumb to thumb. Though this is a difficult way to actually hold the tool. It's easier to have one hand basically at the ferrule, having it under control, and then roll it. And then I use this hand just to try to keep it on the platform, because if it comes off the platform, your angle is going to change. If it comes out left to right, this guy actually comes with this handy dandy little how to stay at a right angle to your belt. The only problem is that there is no flat now. You'd have to, so this would guarantee the right angle, but you wouldn't know when to stop. So it's better to just do it by feel. Alright, that feels sharp all around. We can see that it's a nice even grind. No lumps, no bumps, no flat spots. So there's no need to knock off the shoulder like I'll show with bowl gouges and spindle gouges and almost every other gouge except the skew and the parting tool. Because the SRG is just for this one thing, rounding down spindle blanks, roughing them down. Yeah, and that's all there is to sharpening an SRG. And we're back. Alright, loosen this thing slightly. Okay, so got our sharpened SRG, still trying to get stuff down to the round. So I'm turning up the speed to go with a nice round 700 RPM. So, when cutting, and this is generally true, generally true of all tools, there's a thing called the ABCs of wood turning: anchor, bevel, cut. So make sure you're down first. If you're not, when you touch the wood, you'll get down very, very quickly. You really don't want your fingers underneath it when that happens. So it's best to make sure you have you're in contact with the tool rest. You then get the tool in contact with the piece, but not, as Stu calls it, cutting with a live edge. You want to make sure your bevel is touching the piece first, and then you raise the handle, right? As the handle comes up, the tool goes down, right? And at a certain point, when the wood starts coming up here and it gets just above the cut, that's when you'll start seeing chips. You really don't want to go too much above that. You want a fairly fine cut. It certainly depends on how much of a hurry you're in. Normally when you're starting out, don't be in a hurry, because it's a great way to get hurt. So anchor, bevel, cut. And I always do that pretty much all the time. Eventually, what happens is you get that angle kind of dialed in, and you can just kind of work with it. But in general, when approaching the lathe, at the very beginning of every cut, you want to go through that, because if you go in with a live edge and you take too big a bite, you'll also get a catch, which is the general term for a screw up, user error, if you will, at the lathe. Boy, every time I go past that knot, that's nasty. That's because knots are all end grain. So every time I come by here, twice per revolution, I get a face full of end grain. And this is not an end grain tool. Luckily, it's not a very big knot, so it's just a little unpleasantness. But imagine that, but a whole bowl. So it'd be quite a bit wider, and about 45–50% of what you see as the bowl goes round. So I've almost got this roundish, and I keep working at it with the SRG, probably turn up the speed a little bit more. As it becomes more balanced, it gets safer to increase the speed. And the faster it's going, the more cuts per second, I guess you could say, right? Because the surface speed keeps going up. I think Stu typically runs at about 42 miles an hour for surface speed, which obviously is going to depend on the diameter of the piece, right? Bigger circles, same RPMs, faster surface speed. I could go into the math if you like, but you probably wouldn't. Turn that up a bit more. So now we're going to do, okay, there's 1,000 RPMs. Anchor, double, cut. So by turning on its side like that, you can do more of a planing cut and you'll get a better finish. You're going to be very careful with the point because if it digs in, it's kind of nasty. What I think I might do is I'll just avoid this knot. I mean, this is certainly big enough for a mallet. I mean, I don't really care how big it is, because you know what I could do? I could leave the knot at the striking end just for fun. We'll see. I mean, this piece is bigger than what I need, which is, always better than having a piece that's smaller than what you need. Normally what I would do is I would put a tenon on one end and then put this into a chuck. I don't know if you have a chuck, so I'll see if I can do the whole thing between centers. It'll get a little tricky towards the end, but for the most part, turning this between centers should be safe. Oh, so the planing cut is when you start using the so the SRG is not just a circle, it's a U, right? So it's a circle radius at the bottom, but then it becomes it's got these straight sides. Not all of them have that, some of them are just a U. And what this does is this actually is very similar to a small skew. And a skew is the classic tool for doing all spindle turning. Other than, so most serious spindle turners that I've seen, they're all skew and spindle gouge. Most bowl turners, we tend to like the SRG. And obviously that's a generality, so for the most part it's probably wrong. But hardcore old school, definitely skew. The SRG, there's a guy in Australia that roughed this whole thing down with a skew. Right? And he's phenomenal, and he's been doing it his whole life. For the amateur or the hobbyist, the SRG is a way less stressful way to do this. So, a couple other points. So when I'm trying to get a parallel cut like that, I put my finger underneath the the SRG, and I kind of, using my thumb, sort of lock it in between these two fingers, 3 fingers, with that guy. And then I use the tool rest as sort of a guide. So as long as my tool rest is parallel with the axis of the lathe, sorry, that should give me a really close to parallel cut. Also, when I'm doing this, I find that looking at the cutter is okay when you're starting, but it's not a great indicator as you go. So a lot of times what you do is you look across the top of the piece and you look at this shadow. There's sort of because at this point we're solid wood, so this shadow, there almost wouldn't be one. There's a small flat spot right here. But out here, it's sort of like when you look at an object and you cover one eye and you cover the other eye and you realize that the edge of the object kind of moves. It's sort of like that, where you'll see sort of the shadowy edge and then a solid edge, and that gives you an idea of the difference between the cylinder you're going for and the not quite so cylinder thing that you've got so far. And so you look for those spots, and that gives you a good idea of where to cut. The other trick is to put your tool on top of the piece, and you want to make sure it's this part, not this part. And what'll happen is it'll bounce if the piece isn't round. And anywhere where it is, it'll just sort of sit there. It's a little faster than turning the lathe on and off again. Slight bounce. Much worth bounce. So again, notice my hands don't really move, right? Me and the tool kind of all locked together. I even have, I'll show you more of me. I even have my arms, okay, that's as much as you got. I even have my arms locked to my sides, so as I wobble back and forth, moving the weight between my feet and trying to clear out all the chips, that gives me a much more even and controlled movement than if I were to do like this. Every once in a while you'd see the tool would run into me. When you're doing bowl turning or you're doing curved cuts, typically you don't want the tool to contact your body. If you're doing a curved cut in general, you don't want the tool to contact your body. But this is as straight a cut as it gets, and so definitely the best thing to do, wobble back and forth. Realize I'm getting close to that knot, so I'm going to mark where that is. This is a pretty common trick. So now I know. A little apprehensive knowing that it's there. Now I might be able to get a good cut on this end using a skew, actually. So let's give that a shot just to show you how that would work. So this is a skew. As you can see, it's not straight. So this angle, I don't know. There's a template for the Sorby. This guy's a little bit. So our packet sharpening thing. So in the Stuart Batty world, and most of the rest of the world too, the skew is sharpened at 20 degrees, which is a standard hole. There's a whole hole indicator thing here. And I used to read this thing quite religiously about all the different angles, and then eventually you sort of get your standard angles dialed in and you never look at that thing again. So the angle indicator that I was talking about is this little triangle that goes here, and so you can use that to set the angle on your skew to something consistent. Once you have it set, and I set it not too long ago, you don't really use it much. So skew, unlike the SRG, is a double bevel. Which is why that's one of the reasons it's 20 degrees, because this angle, the angle between the bevels, is still 40 degrees. The SRG is 40 degrees, the bowl gouges, spindle gouges are all done 40 degrees, and they're all single bevel. this guy, double bevel, 20 degrees. The only exceptions to that would be the bottom bowl gouge, which is kind of whatever angle you need, and what is it? Negative rake scrapers. Though I've been sharpening those at 40 because I think it might work just as well. I just need to figure it out. And I'll show those. No, I wouldn't use that on this softwood, actually. So there won't be any negative rake scrapers in this one. So these are, oh yeah, that's good. These are 120 grit belts. This one's just about worn out. I'm waiting for a shipment of new belts. We'll see how they compare to these. These I used to get from Klingspor. They stopped carrying them. Like, they don't carry this grit or the size or both. I don't know. They've reworked their stock in such a way that it doesn't, they don't have the belt that I used to buy, and so I had to go find someone else. Buying them directly from Sorby or buying them through, who else has them? Rockler is a little bit too pricey. These, I can get these for about $3 a belt, and if you buy them at, say, Rockler, I think they're like $5 or $6 a belt. Also, I got some what is it, zirconium oxide ones, and also some aluminum oxide ones. I wanted to see how they compare. I've tried the ceramic ones. I haven't really found those to be all that great. So yeah, we'll see how the new belts do. But anyway, yeah, so I do almost all my sharpening on a 120. Seems like a great grit. I could probably go slightly finer. I've got a 220 belt here. I might give that a spin, see if that holds up. For shaping, I have an 80 grit or 60 grit, I think, when I really need to change the shape of a tool and I don't want to sit here forever and wear out a belt doing it. Those are pretty much the only grits I use, except when I'm sharpening like block planes and chisels, so things for hand work, flat work. For that, I go up to the 600 grit belt, and then I also strop them on a piece of leather, because those you want razor sharp, because you're taking much fewer cuts and you want them to be very high quality. So as you may have seen in the skew sharpening video, it's pretty much the same technique, right? You hold the tool, back up. You hold the tool, kind of loosely. At this end, you have your left or your non-dominant, your recessive hand, I don't know. Your other hand, basically pushing down onto the platform so that the tool stays on the platform. That platform is one of the reasons that most of the stock grinding platforms don't work so well for doing accurate sharpening. You could sharpen this on a whetstone if you really wanted to, and you had an insane amount of time, and you were bored out of your gourd, I guess. I can't imagine sharpening this without some sort of a power grinding system. I originally used a little, 8-inch Raycon, aluminum oxide or whatever the stock stuff is. I used that originally because, well, that Sorby system costs about $550, but hopefully it'll last forever, kind of like this lathe, right? And I decided that I was going to keep doing this for the rest of my life, and so it made sense to get the best tool for the job. Where was I going? Oh yeah. So you can sharpen okay on a grinding wheel. You won't get, so one of the big differences between belt sharpening and wheel sharpening is that my bevels are straight, and on a wheel you get what's called a hollow grind, which means that the bevels are actually slightly concave, and that can actually change slightly the way they cut. It's not a huge difference, because typically for wood turning the wheels are like 10-12 inches, so the amount of curvature over a little 3/8 inch bevel is not that great. Obviously, if you're doing this on like an 8-inch wheel, there's more dip in the middle, and you can really see that when you resharpen wheel sharpened pieces block plane chisels or gouges that have been sharpened on a wheel, and then you get them on the belt, and you'll see that it only hits at the ends, and that's because of that hollow grind until that's removed entirely. So, but yeah, it's the same technique regardless of the tool. So I'm going to show the skew. I use it often, rarely, if that makes any sense. So I don't do a lot of spindle turning, so I need this tool rest actually a bit higher for this guy. But when I do a lot of spindle turning, I try to use the skew. But this is useless from the point of view of a bowl turner, except as Glenn Lucas shows, it's good for removing the plastic from your bowl blanks. I heard it's also really good for prying open paint cans. This tool is the butt end of a lot of jokes, but it's also a very serious tool to the old school turners and to those who do a lot of spindle turning. So anyway, so with the skew, it's really easy to have catches with this tool. In fact, if you look for the Raffin catch video, most of it is skew catches. And so what you need to do, so what happens is that the tool is going to contact at this point, right? Even as you rotate it. Now some skews, they actually have a radiused edge, and that makes this tilting a lot smoother. Right now you can hear it probably clicking back and forth between these. And that's sort of a problem as you're moving, because now as I'm sliding like this, I'm on a very, I'm on a 90-degree corner against this rod, and that's not the smoothest sort of way to slide across a rod, right? So they do a radius so that it slides quite nicely on the short. So this is called the long point, and this is called the short point. And so so for instance, Thompson, which is one of the best tool manufacturers in the world, or at least in the U.S., but I think probably in the world, only radiuses the short point side. And the reason that they do that is so that when you're doing V-cuts, which is long point down, it's still nice and square. Otherwise, you'd have to worry about it tilting. And so so he radiuses only one side. There are some that radius both sides. I think I actually have one. Yeah, this little crown skew. I don't know if you can tell, but it is radiused on both sides. It's a nice little skew for little jobs. Sometimes the 1-inch skew is too big, and so I keep that guy for smaller things. I wouldn't use it for this, and it'd take forever. So anyway, so the point about the point of contact between the skew and the tool rest is that is the side that has to be cutting. If the long point starts cutting and you're anchored against the short point, it'll flip the tool right over. What'll happen is it will kick you out this way typically, because the grain is going to be pushing on the edge, and it will carve a groove across the piece until it's actually shoved the tool back at you. So it's not very pleasant. It's really easy to lose, depending on, this is a fairly simple piece, and even then, it's not that difficult to screw up with a skew, and that's probably why people dislike it. I'm going to bring the tool rest up just a touch more, and so that's so that my the angle, the amount of bevel that can contact the piece is that much less, and so I'm less likely to catch the top corner. Still might happen. Here, I'll zoom in so you can see this one, because hopefully it won't be a catch video, but this is my version of using the skew. And in my defense, I am not a great skew user. So we'll try this at the same speed, 1,000 RPMs. The thing I'm really trying to get around is this knot right here. So I'm just going to take the cut from here to the end and try to plane this smooth. Anchor, bevel, cut. You know what? So quite often, and that was a terrible example of how to use a skewer. When I get frustrated with something like that, I go to a bowl gouge, because this is a tool I do know, Sharpening these, I guess I can put it right here. Sharpening these is a little bit tougher. I'm not going to go into that today. Oh, it's nice and sharp. But I can do almost any cut with a bowl gouge. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called a push cut. And I'm going to come across here. I can also do a shear cut, which is going across that way. This tool rest is way too high for bowl gouge. So bowl gouge, you definitely want cutting on level. And you typically want the cutting point to be on level. And as you can see, even in this little video, that cutting point is maybe a centimeter above the tool rest. So if the tool rest was on center, your cutting is actually a centimeter above. Sorry, I'm practicing my metric. Half an inch. And so quite often you want to be a little bit below center as you cut. So what I'll be able to do is I should be able to slice right through that pretty easily now. So the reason the bowl gouge is so awesome, and that's not a bad finish. I mean, there's a little bit of chatter there, but that's okay. Is because of the angle of the cutter to the fibers, right? So wood's made up of fibers, right? Because this is side grain, all these fibers are going this way. But with the knot, the fibers are coming straight out. So as this cutter is presented to the piece, this is cutting the fibers at right angles when it comes across this knot. It's not exactly right angles across these guys, but because of the way the tool is positioned, because of the floating of the bevel, this is a much better, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at, okay, so all this fluffy bits, that's the SRG. This smooth spot, while I play cameraman here. Whoa, up is down, left is right. Come on, Ron, you can do it. It's even tougher when you're zoomed in. Right there. Okay. So this smooth spot, that's bowl gouge. From here to here is bowl gouge. From here to the other end is SRG. And the reason the SRG chews up wood so quickly is that the cutter is pointed. So remember I was talking about not using an SRG for a bowl. If you look at the cutting edge of an SRG, right, it's always pointed, it's pointed up into the piece. And so the fibers are running this way, and so they're getting peeled off, right? The cutter is getting underneath the fibers, and it's basically peeling them off. But as it's peeling them off, it's kind of ripping them out, but sideways. So 2 layers of fibers, and you're tearing these off the ones underneath. These are the ones underneath. With the bowl gouge, you have these 2 layers of fibers, but the cutter is presented this way, right? You're cutting this way. And so what that does is it allows you to, yes, you're peeling these off, or you're sort of slicing underneath them, because the blade is going this way, not this way like an SRG. Obviously, the funny thing about wood turning is the tool doesn't really move. It's the piece that's going like crazy. That's one of the major differences between flat work, chisels, and all that versus wood turning, is that with wood turning, you just get the tool in the way, and if you do it right, you get something round. With flat work, if your piece is moving, you've got a problem, right? That's why we clamp them down to workbenches, because we want them to stay stationary, because it's our tools that are moving. So, also, I think in general, flat work is a little slower, right? We're not moving. So I think Stu said that if the surface speed is doing 40 miles an hour, then every minute I think is a mile of cutting, right? So. That's a lot of chips. I don't know how long it would take you to produce a mile of shavings from the block plane, but I bet you it would be a lot less, or a lot more than a minute. So now we've gotten this somewhat worked out. Let me show you the shear scrape. So a shear scrape is more of a slice, or a shear slice, or shear scraping. But it's a slicing motion where you actually rotate the gouge like this and you slice this way. And it's actually very similar. In fact, from the point of view of the wood, it's pretty much identical to a small skew. I mean, this is a 40-degree included angle, right? I got 40 degrees on the outside and 0 degrees on the inside, and it's straight because of the way that it's sharpened. And if I present it to the wood like this, you wouldn't know the difference between this and this. So it's the same tool just for the wing. Now for the tip, it's a little different. But for the wing, it basically does the same thing. Now I normally remove my handles when I shear scrape, partially so the handle doesn't run into me. It also discourages me from taking too heavy of a cut because I don't have a whole lot of leverage anymore. That was fun. So you can see that finish. Let's get, maybe I can fix this with lighting. This one. Yeah, there we go. So here, you do an angle light. Now you can see the difference between what I can get with a bowl gouge doing a shear scrape and what a good skew user could do versus what the SRG will give you. But the SRG will go a lot faster. So that's the thing, is that the SRG allows you to chew through wood a lot quicker, unless you have a guy using it who likes to talk a lot. So, and honestly, when you're roughing a 4x4 down to a cylinder, nobody's going to see this, right? You're going to end up cutting through it to make your thing. So these sorts of cuts don't matter really until you start getting down to the finishing part, and you don't want to start with 80 grit sandpaper or worse. So let's see. I'm still not round. I'm going to go back with the SRG again. I'm going to mark off that knot because I'm still not quite round. I mean, I guess I could just start cutting away. So, because I don't want to waste too much time doing all the yakety-yak stuff. So when I sized my my mallet, I just plopped my hand on there, and I said, okay, my hand's about that big, give or take, and then mark those out. So using that same trick, actually you don't have to turn the lathe on. You can just, one reason that this is better when the piece is close to round is because the pencil tends to stay on the surface better. And all you gotta do is scoop that out, and then the rest of it is the wacky part. I leave a little pommel on the end. It feels better on the hand. It also gives you, so I have one in the house that I use quite often. It's made of oak, and it's just a simple cylinder with a handle part cut out and then a pommel at the end. So I'm just going to show you how to do this. This is in spindle turning. There are 3, I think, basic shapes. There are beads, coves, and grooves. Where you can think of a groove as sort of a cove that didn't quite get the edges rounded. And so this is just a big cove. It's just a big dippy-doo. I could do a bead on this end just for fun. And then I guess you could think of this as one big massive bead, maybe? We'll see. So first thing we need to do is, now that we've got these lines marked out, is scoop this out, and that's where typically the spindle gouge comes in. You can do shallow coves with the SRG to go a bit faster, you just have to be very careful of the wings, because once you get this deep into the piece, this wing could catch over here, and that wing could catch over there. But you can obviously you can wear it down if you do it very slowly. So I'm just going to start in the middle and work my way towards both lines. So another thing about the SRG is that it likes side grain. So you can see how it gets a little jumpy on the ends. I believe that's partially because it's seeing end grain now. So as you cut into side grain, these are end grain parts, right? Side grain is looking straight at the growth rings, either straight on or from the side, but not from the top or bottom. This, if you were to stick your eyeball right there and look this way, it would look just like the end of this piece, right? And so the SRG doesn't like that. It doesn't work well with those. So again, believe it or not, the best tool for this job is a bowl gouge. So I'll show you how I'll do this, the rest of this with a bowl gouge. So again, that's the, back this up. So I guess you're going to get some bowl gouge intro for this. And that's just me. I think this is an awesome tool. I use it for everything, almost. Except for the roughing down. I wouldn't use it for that. At least not for spindle. I totally use it for roughing down bowl lines. So the handle's up against the side, tool goes down. I'm going to start with, so with gouges, it'd be easier to see this on an SRG. So there's a thing called open and closed, and everything in between. This is fully open. So quick thing on anatomy of gouges. Bevel, we've already talked about that. Edge, obviously. This is called the heel, that corner between the shaft and the bevel. For some gouges, it makes sense to get rid of that as much as possible. For others, like the SRG, it doesn't matter. These sides are called wings. This middle groove is called a flute. Handle, ferrule, tang. I think that's it. Now, not all gouges have all of those things. In particular, this guy, if he wasn't a handle, I'll show you what it is. So these are one of the bowl gouges I used to use before I switched to the Stuart Batty system. It has no tang. This gouge is made from a single round rod. It's been carved with a groove, a flute, right? It has wings. This groove it feels like an elliptical gouge. And then you can see there, we'll use the Glenn Lucas trick. You can see that I've ground off the heel a bit. So also you can see that this is referred to as a swept, this is not a swept back wing, but the wings are swept back. I know that's kind of confusing. So as you can see with the SRG, it is ground square. It is ground at a right angle to the shaft. The bowl gouge in general is not. I grind these back at 40 degrees, just like Stuart Batty teaches, and I find it works great. This bevel angle is also 40 degrees. That's why he calls it a 40-40 grind. So when the flute is pointed straight up, it is called open. At this point, I thought, so when the flute is parallel with the floor, if you will, or with the axis of the lathe, I thought that was closed, but I think what it sounds like is fully closed is when the flute is pointed at the floor. So pointed at the floor, closed, pointed at the ceiling, open, and then everything in between. So I guess we'll call this half open, right? Where the flute is pointed parallel to the floor, parallel to the axis of the lathe. So when I start this cut, I am going to have the gouge half open. And what that does is it makes the tip of the gouge look like a single line to the wood as it's coming at the gouge, right? So if you look at it right on edge, which I may or may not be able to line up with the camera, this cutting is going to be straight up and down. If it's tilted, if it's slightly open or slightly closed, or anywhere off of half open slash closed, it can skip. It will skid along. What'll happen is the fibers will push on one part of the cutting edge, and it will move it sideways. And that will typically happen when you're first starting a cut. So it's best when you start the cut to be half open. So this is cutting straight up and down. And then once you've pushed in and made a little bit of a groove for yourself, then you can open up the flute a little bit and get a much better cut. And then you start getting into what's called floating the bevel, or rubbing the bevel, depending on how hard you push. And what that does is it actually keeps the cutting edge on line with the direction that you're cutting, right? So you're cutting with the tip, but then the bevel is making contact with the just cut wood, and it's keeping you going in the same direction, which is why I always say that the gouge cuts in whichever way the bevel is pointed. And once it's started, that's fairly true. So if you want to change the direction of a cut, what you think about is changing the direction of the bevel, and that will basically steer the tool in the direction you want to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start cutting on this line with it half open, and then once I get that started, I will rotate the handle this way to basically get, let me zoom this in a bit so you can really see this. This may be a bit more involved than you wanted, but you can always fast forward and pretend like I didn't say anything. Start with it half open. It gives you a nice clean entry cut. And then once it's started, now this is a really thick cut. I mean, it's not quite half an inch, but that's a lot of wood to remove. So I'll probably start a little bit farther over, maybe cut off maybe 1/8 of an inch at the same time. And so once that starts, right? So and you can see how if as I rotate the tool, I can get it to steer to the right, or if I rotate it this way, it'll steer to the left, right? That's what I was talking about, skidding. So when this piece is spinning in 1,000 RPMs, and you do that, when it skids, you won't be able to stop it. It'll be over before you even realize it started. So what you do is you use your left hand to plant the tool on the tool rest, and you gently push it in to get that started. But you want to make sure you don't take too big a cut. And then once that's started, as you rotate the tool, it will start to travel forward. And you want to make sure that you don't cut too much at a time. So it's very important to cut at a good rate. If you get too much cutting, you get a leverage catch. You'll also typically get a lot more torn grain, because you'll be taking big chunks of wood out, but you'll also be making a mess of your piece. So let me show you that, and then yeah, so there goes. So half open, started, rotate. Start again, half open, started, rotate. And that should be a fairly clean cut. Oh yeah, pretty good. And this is really soft wood, right? This is spruce or fir or whatever they make this stuff out of. And you can do that on both sides. So let's do that on this side as well. Half open. So when it started to chatter, right, when the tool started to bounce, that's when it started doing some of these heavier cuts, where it started really ripping out some wood. And so with those, I tend to stop pushing forward, wait for the tool to settle down again, and then gently go forward again. You don't want to push through the chatter. There we go. So as I was saying before I turned the camera on, I was just looking at the mallet that I have inside. The handle diameter is about 1 inch, so I'm just going to keep scooping this down with the bowl gouge until I get to the diameter that I want. Then I'm going to round this over. Normally, when you're doing spindle turning, I'm just going to loosen this up and make sure this is tight. You start furthest from the headstock and you work your way back, because as you thin the stock down, if you're doing finer stuff, you have to remember that all the torque comes from here, it comes from the spindle end. And so if you make some skinny little stretch here, and then you start doing work over here, all that torque is going through that skinny piece of wood before it actually gets to the cutter, which is then pushing back on all that torque. And so that skinny piece of wood, the thinner it is, the more likely it is to snap. So typically it's easiest to work, once you get the whole thing roughed down, start away from the headstock, and so you have all this thick stock to carry all that torque through, and then you can work on this. So let's still using the 5/8 bowl gouge, still fairly, yeah, it's still fairly sharp. I mean, this is a soft wood, so it's going to last a while. So I'm going to try to take small cuts. So I'm going to start, let me zoom this in a little bit so you can see what's going on. So I'm taking a fairly small cut, about that 1/8 of an inch, and then just keep doing cuts like that all the way down to the bottom of the cove. Sorry, camera challenged here. All right, good. Now, because I already have a notch to push against, so I can get the bevel rubbing there, I don't need to worry about it skidding, because it's not a flat surface anymore, it's a sloped surface. And so the bevel is going to continue to follow that sloped surface. So for these cuts, what I'm doing is I'm pivoting, I'm anchoring the bevel with my left. Oh, wrong way. I'm anchoring the bevel with my left and then swinging my hip to the right, so I can do these very fairly easy sweeping cuts. It's much more controlled, like I said, than having the hands away from your body. Also, what I'm doing is I have to keep working the material back and forth, right? Because you should only be cutting on the downhill. Every woodworker knows that you always cut wood on the downhill, which means that as you're cutting, you're going through progressively deeper growth rings or fibers. If you're cutting uphill and you start hitting those fibers, you're going to tear them out. You could have a catch, you could tear up the piece. There are a lot of reasons not to do it. Now, as I'm making these cuts, I've got the bevel at about, what would that be, about 10 o'clock, 10:30. So it's up slightly less than 45 degrees open. That seems to be, a lot of that is by feel, to figure out where because the more it's closed, the slower the cut will be. The more it's open, the faster the cut will be, but the more aggressive it will also be, so it tends to chew up. So when you start running into a cut that's fighting you, first thing you want to check is sharpness, and this tool is actually starting to lose its edge, so I'm going to swap it out for my backup, because I have to have two. So I sharpen them in pairs, and so yeah. So when you first started having trouble doing the cut, check the sharpness. If it's not that, it could be something with the wood, like that knot. It could be that you're just cutting too aggressively and you need to go with a shallower cut. These are the little adjustments that you learn as you do it, how the wood behaves, and the sort of feedback that you get from your tools, and also the sound, right? You want this nice even sound. When you get that choppy sound, that means you're not making even contact with the piece. And so what I'll do is I'll keep working these down, and then I'll do a sphere cut on the back end just to kind of show that. I'm not sure how much you'll be able to see on the video. I admit I'm not as practiced with these things as I wish I was, but you know, everything takes time. So I spend more time working on getting good at the lathe than I do at getting good at recording what I'm doing on the lathe. So maybe that'll change over time. And I can tell, based on where I'm cutting, that I am cutting above center, right? So, so I need to drop the tool rest down a little bit, because ideally I want to be cutting at center. Yeah, so you can see how clean, well maybe you can. So you can see how clean this cut is. There's a tiny amount of torn fibers here, but for the most part that's a very clean cut. On this side it's a little bit less so, but another thing in wood turning is you want to get, in theory, you want to get as good turning left-handed as right-handed. In practice, you're normally going to have a better side and a lesser side. That's just a fact of being human. So it's not quite an inch. It's not as small as I'd like to be, and obviously it's, excuse me, I'm probably going to sneeze really soon. It's not quite as smooth as I would like it to be. Thank you. Lots of dust. So, yeah, so I'm going to keep working that down. I was thinking I could go at it with the SRG and probably smooth that down a bit too. But, the other thing, like I said, since I'm already using the bowl gouge, is I'll probably go to a shear scrape and come across that way. There are a lot of different ways to turn these, so, but bowl gouge, definitely the best way. Let me just shear scrape this smooth, just so it's smooth. So for shear scraping, because you need a much steeper angle than when you're cutting, I drop the tool rest a little bit more for that. So let's see how that fits. It's too tight, that's for sure. I can always bring either of these ends out. More likely than not, I'd sacrifice the pommel end. I also need to make this, I mean, as far as the slope, it feels kind of nice because of how it pushes up against the hand. Normally when you're using a mallet, at least when I use a mallet, I have normally a fairly loose grip. I mean, there's not a lot of point in holding on for dear life with a mallet, right? Because mostly it's just to have accurate taps on a chisel or whatever. Also, I might try to make this a little less straight, make it slightly concave. So there, to get more of a concave curve, I turn the gouge more open once. So you see I started with it fully closed, or sorry, half open, and then once it got going, once you have that surface for the bevel to float on, you can rotate it and take advantage of the fact that the tip of this tool is actually curved, and you can get a curved cut. The tricky part with doing that is that if you over-rotate, you will catch this edge and it will flip and tear out a big old chunk. So it's a cut that is really effective, but potentially problematic. It's slightly more complicated than a simple, say, scraper or something. There are a lot of techniques that you run into with the bowl gouge, and a lot of the best cuts are full open with a very light cut on one of the wings. Also, when I do the sphere cut, That actually starts with the tip. That's a fairly complex cut, but I just like to do it. It's great practice. And a lot of wood turning is practice. Even after a few years, you still need to practice. Every piece is some kind of practice, right? Actually, I'll show you the shear cut or the sphere cut real quick because it's fun. So with that one, you actually start full open, and then you actually I might need to zoom out so you can see this movement. I got to figure out which direction is out. All right. Also, I think I want to use a shorter handle for this one, which I happen to have. This is a little 14-inch maple handle that I made, one of the first ones. So with that one, you're all the way down. Tip is barely going to be touching. Once it starts to cut, you actually roll into it. Now, what I'll probably do is start out by knocking off these points, or maybe I'll just do a half sphere. That's what I did on the other one. So yeah, you want to get rid of the high points because you can't do a very heavy cut with a sphere cut. Now where I paused there, I was getting a bounce. It didn't get too bad. But typically you get bounces because you're pushing in too hard against the piece. And so what happens is when you're on the softer grain, the wood actually gives a little bit. And then as it comes around to where the annual rings are pointed at you, it pushes the tool away. And so of course that creates an oscillation, right? Because every half rotation you end up with either one of these or one of those. And so if you're pushing against it, you will actually amplify that oscillation, and then you'll end up with a kind of a spiral wave that follows that. It also has to do with the heel length, because what's hitting it quite often is actually the heel on the gouge as you're cutting. Right, the heel is trailing, and when the harder wood comes by, it pushes it away, right, which pulls the cutting edge slightly out of the wood, and then as it gets into the softer wood, it pushes back in, and so as the tip is getting pushed back and forth, it basically creates it's self-reinforcing, in that the more that you push against it, the stronger it's going to push back. The more you're going to push against it, the deeper the grooves are going to get. So eventually you'll totally lose control of it, so you don't normally go that far. So when that starts to happen, what you want to do is stop pushing forward, wait for everything to settle down, and then see if you can pick up the cut. And sometimes you have to back up before the bounce started to a smooth part. And a lot of times I find that doing a shear scrape to create a smooth part helps quite a bit. In fact, I'll show you that right here. If I had a bounce or something and I wanted to create a smooth surface, I would do a shear scrape. Because this handle is short, I'll leave it attached. And then it'll get rid of this and give me a nice smooth surface. And then I can place the bevel on that surface and get a much smoother cut. So as you can see, that's a very smooth surface. Sorry. Oh yes. Okay, so away is in and toward is out. Got it. So anyway, I don't know if you can see it, but it is quite smooth. And so what that does is it gives me a very nice flat surface to plant the gouge, so that when I start to cut, I know at least at the very beginning I'll be going in the right direction. I might still end up with a bounce, but at least I start with the gouge in a very stable situation, right? If you start on a bounce, you probably are not going to recover. But if you start on the smooth and you do it right, you shouldn't get a bounce. So at that point where I stopped and backed up, but I tried to keep the same angle, but I moved out a little bit. That's because I could tell that the cut was getting too deep. I was cutting too much wood. And so I wanted to finish a cut. And if I keep it going in the same direction, that means if I follow that surface again, I should end up basically producing the cut I originally wanted. Now I'll go back, pick that cut up again. Not quite a sphere, but that's the general gist. It is a complicated cut. It involves all four movements of the gouge, which are all driven by the right hand. So there is lift, where you're moving, and let's go. Let's see. This way is out. This way is out. Hey, got it right. So there is lift, where you're raising and lowering the handle. There is twist, where you're rotating the tool. There is swing, where you're actually moving the handle left to right or away and toward your body. And then there is, what's he called, the fourth one? This is another Stuart Brady thing. Basically, there's a push movement where you're moving the tool forward. So you have to lift it at the beginning. So as you're coming around, not only are you lifting, but you're also rotating, pushing, and swinging all at the same time. So all four movements come into play with this cut, which is why it's a great cut for practice. I mean, if you can get that one down, most of spindle turning, I think, again, I'm not an expert, but most of spindle turning seems to be somewhat encapsulated within that one cut. And then the rest of it is, the starting, the scooping. So you have a convex and you have a concave, right? Surfaces are all either concave, convex, or straight. I mean, that's, what else could there be? Obviously this pommel is way too big, but it's just sort of an example. Now let me finish up this handle, and then I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with this. I mean, with a mallet, I mean, you could do all sorts of things. You could cut little grooves in it. You could, burn lines into those grooves. I mean, honestly, a mallet is just a cylinder with a handle attached, as far as I'm concerned. Let's try this one. So I'm going to try this one left-handed. This will be fun. So you see my right hand is now in front, and my left hand is the front hand. To try to do this as a concave left-handed. I want extra light for this. Okay, unfortunately, my body's getting in the way, so let me see if I can fix that up with a right hand. That was a bit easier. So, in general, in the Stuart Batty school, if you will, the left hand is all about stability. It's all about adding weight to the front and keeping the tool from skidding. After that, it's really just to weight down the front of the tool, because, to slightly counteract the chatter. But it does not direct the tool. I try to, in some cases I even open up my hand. In certain cuts you can actually just take your hand away. All of the control comes from the right hand. So the right hand is doing the driving, right? It's pushing the tool forward, it's swinging the tool, it's rotating the tool. So it controls all movement of the tool, whereas the left hand is there for stabilizing, or I should say your dominant hand and your recessive. So these are about the same diameter. I just need to connect these two curves together. I'm going to go a little narrower. Let's see how that feels. Yeah, see, it's still too big, or too small. I mean, my hand is too big. I'm going to bring this in a little bit to try to make the handle part a little longer. I'll try using the SRG to just reduce that a bit. Now let's clear scrape it smooth. Back this down a little bit. Oh yeah, that would work. Alright. So, obviously it's cylinder with a handle. So, one other thing that I was thinking is that normally I wouldn't do this entirely between centers. I sort of did. I limited myself to that because that's what I figure almost everybody would have. Ideally what I would do is if we measure the diameter here, okay, and then I have a board, which of course is over here behind the camera. So at the beginning of the video I said that normally I would just throw that 4x4 into my 130 mil jaws and that would be it. So given the diameter of that cylinder, I can see that I can fit a 100 mil tenon on there. You can't really see it here, but right there it's 100 millimeter. And so this is the tenon or inside range, and this is the mortise or outside range on those jaws. And so when I need to make a tenon or a mortise for 100 mil, I measure to this and then I add about a little bit more than a quarter, or a little less than a quarter inch, I guess. And then I basically make the tenon or the mortise that size. So in this case I can see, given that range, I can fit it to 100 millimeter. There really isn't any other jaw other than the power grip, which is really technically it's also a 100 mil jaw. It's just like the Titan 3 power grip is a 130 mil. It just has a little bit more range and it's deeper. So anyway, so I could size this to 100 mil. So I would make it right about there. Doesn't have to be precise. With bowls you want to be a little bit more precise. So let's make a mortise real quick, or a tenon or spigot real quick on this, and I'll show you how I normally chalk it up. So the easiest way to cut one of these, and since we're back out on the piece, I'm going to bring the tool rest back up to the proper height. Right, so we're cutting at center. The easiest way to make one of these is with a, oddly enough, with a ball gouge. So it's funny how that works. So I'll do that real quick. So the important thing with a mortise, a tenon or spigot, is that the shoulder here is square, and ideally the angle of the smaller part matches the angle of the jaws, the dovetail jaws or the serrated jaws you're using. The difference between dovetail jaws and serrated jaws is that so here you can see, and I didn't check its size, but I know that even the largest one that I have, I'm already within the range of that chuck. So I'll show you what I would have done with that real quick. So normally I would have roughed it down and then got the mortise on there. So to remove this guy, use a knockout bar, which is just a steel rod. Goes inside here, and since these guys are hollow, you can just knock them out. So here are, these are 100 mil. this off a touch. There's just too many. With tenons that you don't plan to be part of the finished piece, you can go a little oversized, and what'll happen is you'll see that you gotta make sure they're clean. Another important thing is that the height of this, from the shoulder to the bottom, you don't want that to exceed the depth of your jaws, because otherwise the bottom will hit the inside, and you won't get what's called good registration. You want to make sure that when you chuck this up, that it goes right back where it was when you cut it. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing with my right hand so that the shoulder is seated on the surface of the jaws, and then tighten it up. So I was saying, now if we look at it, we'll back that off, we should see, yes, there we go, are indentation marks from the jaws, right, from the corners of those four pieces. The reason you want to center that on the grain is so that where those dig in is of even density. If it's skewed and the density is different, it'll cause the piece to shift. So that's why you want to line those up. That's a Glenn Lucas trick. You can pick up a lot of stuff from different people's videos. So in order to get this to line up again, I'm going to bring the tailstock up just to sort of hold it there. And then tighten this down again. And so what's nice about that is now I can get rid of the tailstock. And I can finish the sphere cut if I wanted to. Or I can do a whole lot more taping. That is way more sturdy. Now, when I first start turning it, I would bring the tailstock up anyway. So I'd have it on jaws and with tailstock. And that is the most secure chucking you can have for a piece. There's, short of the piece exploding, or at least splitting like in a huge way, there is no way for this to come off, assuming that your tenon is good, right, that you made it properly so that it lines up with your jaws, and your tailstock is in place and you locked it, right? Obviously if you don't lock it, it's going to move. So yeah, that's the basics on making a mallet. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, let me know.